first shared their stories in caves, connected art, nature, and science, led us toward new horizons. Who thought to capture motion, spark an engine to life, turn television into a playground? Every day, you create the playful, the functional, and the unexpected. You break down walls and take us to astonishing places. Tell stories, leap borders, and create beauty for tomorrow. Because at Unity, we believe the world is a better place with more creators in it, where everyone has a chance to shape the world.
Good afternoon, South APAC, to all of our audience joining us from the Greater India region, Southeast Asia region, and also Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific. And you can tell we've got a pretty diverse group by all of our welcome messages there. Just some tips and hints for today's interaction in the webinar. If you'd like a question to be answered, make sure it goes in the Q&A box. Please don't use the chat box for questions. We won't be able to have our team in there answering those ones, and we don't use the raise hand function in this webinar also. Today's session is going to be about 75 minutes. Unity is being used in a multitude of industries, from architecture, engineering, construction, automotive, transport and manufacturing, education, film and animation. It's being used in some pretty cool projects worldwide, from running facility management and simulation in airports through to management of pipelines in oil and gas industry, and much, much more. What does that mean for you? It means that if you're competent in Unity, not only do you have a career opportunity in games, but you also have an opportunity to work with Unity in many different industries across a wide spectrum. And to do that, be great for you to consider to be Unity certified. There's different levels of Unity certification, and you can start that process right now. Recently, Unity has acquired a couple of interesting companies and tool sets that will eventually become integrated into the Unity family. Weta Digital, the special effects company based out of New Zealand, behind such movies as Lord of the Rings and the new Doctor Strange and Batman movie, as well as Ziva Dynamics, who make ultra-realistic humans powered by machine learning and AI. One of our lucky attendees today who have registered with us are eligible to win a Unity swag pack. This will be drawn about 30 minutes after today's webinar. It's only available to registered attendees. If you're joining us from a social media channel, you can scan the QR code to register if you would like to qualify. And you also have a chance to grab this on this screen too. This is your last chance to grab the QR code, so grab your phone and scan away. Here are some recent winners, and they've sent us some photos. Thank you very much. We always love to see our fans and developers in Unity swag. It looks awesome. Scan that QR code to qualify. And today we're covering physics in part 2 of our Building an Arcade Races series. This is always really fun, and I'm really looking forward to today's content tech. We pre-recorded this session last night to optimize for quality. If you've joined us through some of our webinars over the last year and a half, when we're using the editor, it can get a bit unclear for some of our folks joining us in areas where bandwidth may not be as good. So hopefully we will have a very clear delivery for you today. I'm in the webinar today, and there's several members from the team also joining us today to answer your questions from India, Singapore, Malaysia, and Australia. So pretty big representation from the Unity field engineers today. And with that said, take it away.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Today we are continuing our Arcade Racer series. Specifically today, I'm going to be talking about physics. Now, this is a fairly dense topic, so I'm just going to go right through it. So what are we covering today? primarily we're largely going to be looking at the rolling ball vehicle controller. It's a technique I've used in the past. It's also a technique that's sort of has regained popularity recently. Long story short, it basically involves using physics to push a ball around, or in my case, spin a ball around, and have it move around. And then you literally just use the visuals of a car, kind of overlay on that, just so it looks more like a car rather than pushing a ball around like Super Monkey Ball. We're going to look a little at wheel colliders and sort of how they work, a little bit of what goes on under the hood, how they deal with forces, suspension, tire grip, friction. Lastly, and because during the course of this webinar I started kind of diving a lot deeper than I expected to into just sort of custom physics. We're going to have a light primer on custom wheel and suspension implementations. So with that said, you may or may not be asking, why physics? If I'm doing like an arcade racer, why am I using physics instead of, let's say, just directly propelling the object of the car along with, say, transform.translate, just update its position, figure out its speed, and just kind of move it along, right? Or do like a top-down spy racer, spy hunter sort of thing, right? Where you just need to move things around. You don't really need physics. Something that physics does sort of give you is essentially for no real effort is collisions, and more importantly, collision responses. This means if you're pushing a rigid body with a collider around with just with forces, anytime that collider, that rigid body comes into contact with another collider, whether that's a dynamic rigid body or it's a static piece of geometry like a wall, it's going to either bounce off or slide along. If the other object is dynamic, it may also get, the other object may also get propelled ahead. So as you can see on the right here, there's a lot of just cars running around and knocking into each other. There are drawbacks to using physics. Sometimes there can be. One of these is that it can be very tricky to tune physics. The further you get away from realism, the harder it is to kind of tune those physics. So whether that's gameplay mechanics, if you're doing a racer, it might be how fast something accelerates, how fast its top speed is. If you're talking about like art direction, that can also be difficult, right? Like trying to tune how quickly something jumps and falls can be very tricky to tune if you're using pure physics. Physics is kind of hard to art direct. But there's a place for physics. There's a place for using something a bit more custom. Something can't get away from. There will be some math in this topic on this webinar. It's not going to get super deep. We're not going to do like derivatives and integrals, partly because I'm not really great at those either. But there will be some math, mainly sort of geometric stuff, dot products, cross products, that sort of thing. So very briefly, we'll talk about sort of like types of racers. If we broadly break down, sort of the spectrum of racing games, you can kind of break them down in these sort of 4 bands, I guess. You've got your kart racer, like a Mario Kart. I guess sort of like the old Outruns. Fairly simplistic. You got your sort of arcade racers, which I guess would be maybe something like along the lines of Daytona. Simcade might get sort of, I guess arcade Simcade sort of will straddle something like Daytona, your Need for Speeds, and then like a full sim, which would probably be something like Live for Speed, Assetto Corsa, those where they get really, really detailed into their physics, their tire friction models, suspension, how everything works. What we're going to look at is probably squarely around, somewhere around um, the arcade area, perhaps kart racer, somewhere around here. If we're looking at the rolling ball, the custom one may move somewhere in between arcade and simcade, depending on how deep you want to get into that. For this rolling ball demo, we're going to start with the scene setup. We're going to need a plane, and this is really just to have some ground for this the ball to roll around on. We're going to create an empty object, and this will be a car representation and a sphere. Now, this sphere is really just going to hold the rigid body that the controller is going to reference. Now I'm going to move this up, and I'm going to give this this object actually a better material so that you can see it actually roll around. So now on the car, so we've added a rigid body to this thing. Now on the car, we're going to add the rollerball simple script, and this has a few parameters that we'll look at in a minute. Now, before we start looking at the script, we're going to look at what we're trying to sort of accomplish with this script. We are basically looking at a few forces that we need to apply. So we have an acceleration force, which will be applied in the forward direction of your transform. That would be in the z direction here. That would be, I've got an acceleration force. All right, this is my A. We've got a brake force, which will be applied in the rearward direction. We have a lateral friction, and this will essentially take my sideways speed and apply up to a maximum of my lateral friction back this way in order to reduce my sideways speed to 0. So I'm not gliding along sideways. And I have forward friction, and this similarly, if I'm not accelerating, it will take my forward speed and apply a maximum of my forward friction backwards in order to slow me down. So both the side friction and the lateral friction are clamped so that they never exceed the forward or side speed. And this is just so that you don't get a situation where, as my side friction is trying to bring back to 0, it overshoots and starts to oscillate. So clamping it makes sure that doesn't happen. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the script. It's a fairly simple script. There's not too many lines of code here. And really it's just a simple amount of behavior. It has a few public properties. So we've got a rigid body, which is our reference to that rolling rigid body. We have an acceleration force, a braking force, lateral friction, forward friction, turn speed, and a visual. And this visual we'll look at in a bit. So all of these are basically forces and not torques. So all of these are in, their units are basically in newtons. The turn speed is actually in degrees per second. So 60 degrees per second, 90 degrees per second. My teammate Hector is going to take a look at the input system in a couple weeks, so I'll leave that to him. But we're using the input system to kind of drive everything. We take a reference to the sphere collider so that we can get the radius of that sphere collider, and we have a boolean to check whether we're grounded, whether the ball is actually touching the ground. So in Awake, we just kind of get our inputs and kind of set up our inputs and get a reference to our sphere collider. And really this is only done because we don't want it to get a component every frame. So we cache that. I'll skip update first. We'll go straight to fixed update. Now fixed update, as I mentioned earlier, is basically the loop where you're going to be doing all of your physics functions. Anything that applies forces, torques to rigid bodies, this always is going to happen in fixed update. And the reason for that is that the regular update loop has a variable frame time. You can, if your performance is low, you might be running at 15 frames per second, you might be running at 30, you might be running at 60. So each frame will have a different delta time, and if you vary that for physics calculations, that can cause spikes in velocity, or in sort of like the translation, or so it just kind of leads to bad things. Either you'll have inaccurate physics calculations. So fixed update runs on a fixed loop every 20 milliseconds by default, so 50 frames per second. So here we are going into fixed update, and we're calculating a few things. We're calculating our forward speed and our lateral speed. Now, we sort of need to do this because remember that we are trying to calculate a forward friction, I guess a longitudinal friction, and a lateral friction. And in order to clamp those, we need to find out the actual speed, the magnitude of our velocity in our forward direction and our lateral direction. And so we do this by getting a dot product. The rigid body velocity gives you a vector, a direction, and a magnitude. And we need to find what is the velocity or what is the speed in those two specific directions. Now we do this with dot product. The dot product ends up being a very, very useful function. But really all it's doing is, if this is my forward vector and this is my right vector, if I have a velocity vector here, and I want to get, I want to make sure I get the magnitude in my forward direction, if I take a dot product of my velocity vector and my forward vector, that just literally just kind of gives me this. All right, so now I have the length. Similarly, if I do dot product against the right, my right vector, then I get the length of this portion, and so that gives me my my lateral speed. Jumping back in, so that's exactly what we're doing here. We're taking our rigid body velocity, and we're doing a dot product against the forward vector, and once again in the right vector. So that's my speed forward, my speed lateral. We're doing a grounded check. We're storing that grounded check. We'll see why later. By doing a sphere cast. The reason I'm not doing a ray cast is because we've got this ball that's easily half a meter to 1 meter in radius. It's generally, you're generally going to get better results doing a sphere cast, because if you have a slope in front of you, your ray cast is probably not going to catch that slope before your sphere actually contacts it. So instead we do a sphere cast, and we're going from, there's a little thing that I'm doing here, which is I'm not sphere casting directly from the rigid body's position. I'm offsetting it upwards by just a little bit, and the reason being that a sphere cast that where the sphere kind of starts inside or already overlapping a collider will not register a hit on that collider. So I kind of shift it up a bit. We pass in the sphere collider's radius, and we grab the sphere collider earlier. We cast it directly downwards based on the transform. We store that hit, and this is we kind of max out our distance at just over, just a little bit over that offset. We don't want to, we don't want to cast the sphere too far, because we want to make sure that it only hits if it's just just about to touch the ground. We don't want it to align with the ground, and we don't want it to report that it's grounded, even though it's like a meter or two off the ground. So we limit the distance of that cast to 0.2, basically 20 centimeters, and we're storing that in the grounded boolean. So if we're grounded, we do that check. This is basically so that we're not able to accelerate and turn while we're in midair. So we're basically doing our forces here after checking if we're grounded. So we're basically applying a linear force forward in our transform forward direction based on acceleration force and multiplied by our inputs, right? Our accelerate input. Similarly for your braking, you're doing it backwards, so minus transform dot forward times your brake force, and again times your input. Now I'm not clamping this in order to essentially have the brake act or become a reverse gear after you've stopped. So once you've stopped, basically the brake force, the brake becomes a reverse gear. Now the clamping starts coming into play when you're doing drag or friction, or in this case, so our side drag, which is essentially the side drag is always going to be higher than your forward drag, just because of how the tires are basically going to be trying to go sideways, and they're naturally going to try to stop you from going sideways. And so so what we're doing here is we've already calculated our lateral speed. So to clamp it, all we're doing is first we need to make sure that we get the absolute value, so we're not kind of getting thrown off by a negative value, because positive is right, negative means you're sliding left. So we take the absolute of the lateral speed, we multiply it by our mass, and we get the minimum of our lateral friction and the lateral force now, because you're multiplying by the mass. So we take the minimum of that so that we don't get that situation where our lateral friction overshoots and we start oscillating. And then we multiply it by the sine of that speed lateral, because earlier we took the absolute. And all in, we sort of negate that so that we're actually applying this friction force in the opposite direction of our speed. So we're slowing down instead of accelerating. We do exactly the same thing for the forward friction, just using speed forward instead of speed lateral, and pushing backwards instead of to the side. Now over here we're kind of doing another sort of mathy thing. We're taking the cross product, and really this is so that we can align our visual sort of model to the ground underneath. So if we hit a slope, the model will actually kind of align with the ground. And so because we're doing the sphere cast, we get a hit, a raycast hit, and that, among other things, we can get the normal of the surface. Now the cross product here is really due to the fact that the look rotation needs to get a proper forward vector and an up vector. The forward vector has to actually be accurate, and so the forward vector has to be aligned with the surface in order for the rotation to be correct, in order to align it. So what that cross product looks like is basically the contact against that slope. Taking the slope's normal, which is pointing directly upwards. We're taking the right vector, because that's the only thing that we can guarantee is, basically going to be orthogonal to the slope, 90 degrees to the slope. And what this basically gives us is when we do a cross product, that gives us an orthogonal vector which aligns exactly with this this slope. So that's now our forward vector. We are basically calculating our forward vector using that cross product, our right vector, and the hit normal, which gives us a forward vector. We then assign the visual, our car model. We assign its rotation to using this helper function, concerning look rotation, which returns a rotation based on the forward vector and up vector that you give it. Lastly, back in the update function, we're checking if we're grounded. If we're grounded, we're allowed to rotate, basically turn the car, and we're also constantly updating the position of our transform back to the rigid body. And so in practice, what that looks like. So reset this guy. So in practice, what that looks like is we've got our empty car model here. We're going to assign the rigid body. We're going to pop in an acceleration force, a brake force, let's say 5 newtons, lateral friction of say 10, forward friction of say 5, 90 degrees per second turn speed. And we're going to give this guy a very basic looking car body. And we're going to get rid of the box collider because the collision is all going to come from the rigid body. So you hit play. I've got something. Oh, and I need to assign the visual to a cube. So now we've got the car sort of, the car body sort of being placed at the rigid body. So I can turn because I'm grounded. I can drive, go over the slope, and the car body will automatically, sort of align with that slope. So that's kind of cool. Because this is just a pure visual thing, this cube, I can replace that cube with something like a car body. So let's take my car body. I will lower it down a bit. What I'm also going to do is I'm actually going to get rid of the mesh renderer here, and I'm going to increase the size of that sphere, just because it matches a little bit better with the size of the car. And I'm going to assign that visual. And I'm going to drive over that. So now we have a very, very simple, sort of a vehicle controller. I can drive around, I can sort of drift, which is kind of fun. It's a very static model at the moment. There's no, wheel animations, but that sort of thing you can kind of add on later on. So now that we've taken a look at, sort of the basics of getting one of those rollerball controllers done, we're going to look at what you can do with a bit more, time, a bit more love. I'll cover a little bit of what I did here, but otherwise the project is available for you to kind of dive in and take a look at. But here we go. So we've got wheels that turn, and this is all sort of taking the same core principles of rolling a ball around. If I select the sphere, you can kind of see it as it's rolling around. So it's the same general principles, but it's doing a couple things slightly differently. Still, same principles of side friction, acceleration, braking. but it does a few things differently because, you know, based on my personal preferences. For me, I've always sort of seen arcade racing games as very drift happy. I'm happiest when I'm, you know, in racing games when I can drift. So that sort of informed a lot of the decisions that went into building this controller here. Couple of the things here are that I'm actually not using linear force to push the rolling ball. I'm actually spinning it, so I'm using torque instead of linear forces. Now, part of the reason for that is that because I'm spinning it directly, I can directly use the friction of the ground in order to kind of figure out how slidey or how much wheel spin I'm going to have. Because I'm using the torque, because I'm spinning the ball, I can also kind of figure out how much wheel spin I have. Right? If it's slippery ground and I've got too much engine torque, then my wheels are going to be you know, spinning a lot, and from there I throw up a lot of smoke. Yeah, I'm also kind of driving the amount of side friction based on the amount of wheel spin. So if I'm spinning my wheels a lot, I have less side friction. So you know, I can sort of do that initial D sort of drift, right? Or if I'm wheel spinning a lot, I can keep on sort of drifting sideways, which is kind of a fun thing. One of the downsides of kind of using that sphere cast is occasionally you can get what just happened there, which is you know, if you get really close to something, you might end up sort of popping up against the side of it, like a wall. Some other interesting things that you can sort of consider when you're sort of building your cars and tuning them, balancing them, is that first you want to always kind of give quite a number of parameters to tune. So things like, in my case, torque, how much steer angle there is, how much side friction. I use a lot of curves in sort of like my vehicle controllers. So some of these are things like rolling friction. In this case, I've got a curve that, so I mentioned earlier that the more wheel spin I have, the less side friction I have, and so that kind of plays into this, where if I've got a lot of wheel spin, then basically I get low friction over here. If I have less wheel spin, I get higher, I get sort of higher grip. My torque curve sort of is a very simplified. It's a simplification of, you know, how an engine works with its torque curve. Higher RPM, you know, you've got an engine torque curve based on the RPMs, based on the engine performance, as well as the gear ratios, right? Your low gears, your high gears will give you different amounts of torque. So this is sort of like a simplification of that. I essentially compare this against my speed. At low speeds, I have very high torque. As I approach my maximum speed, which is over here, I get progressively less torque, and this also prevents me from accelerating indefinitely. My maximum velocity. So if I can tune this, so part of this is kind of like the curves, as well as all these values means that I can kind of tune this so that, you know, I'm capping my maximum velocity at 60 kilometers an hour. And so this makes it sort of a lot easier to tune than kind of trying to figure out gear ratios and, you know, how many gears, what are the gear ratios. You know, at first gear I'm at, you know, 3.4, at second gear I'm at 2.3, and kind of trying to figure out how to figure out your top speed from that. So this makes it a lot easier for game design. And then the other thing that's actually sort of really useful, it's good for kind of final polish, but it's also really useful to kind of have hookups, whether it's your debug logs over here or like a UI thing that kind of tells you how much you're steering, what your throttle is like, how much you're braking, because that kind of helps you. It kind of helps you troubleshoot certain problems, like whether or not you should be sliding versus whether or not you should be kind of driving forward. One of the later examples I'll show you has a lot of debug info. So yeah, curves are really useful. Let's jump into the code here. But basically this code, all it is I mean, it's okay. It's actually fairly involved, but this is the sort of like the key thing here, right? Animation curves. Animation curves allow you to set allows a designer to set kind of a curve based on what he thinks the car should drive like. You know, your torque curve. If I were to change the torque curve over here from this to, let's say, something like this, then my acceleration pattern would be very different. I would accelerate very slowly, but eventually sort of hit like 60 kilometers an hour, as compared to this curve where I'll accelerate very quickly, and so a lot of that will come down to sort of like your game design needs. That's your rolling friction, your torque curve, and if you're not familiar with animation curves, let's see. All it is you're just taking that curve and doing an evaluate on it, and you're basically sampling this curve at these values. So if you keep this curve at like a 0 to 1 on the x-axis, then you get something that's quite easy to work with. So for example, in this case, I'm sampling the curve based on my current velocity, or my current actual wheel velocity versus my actual max velocity that I've set in this property. So it's pretty useful in that case to set how much torque I'm actually getting out of my wheels based on certain factors. So one other nice thing about kind of using this sort of model, this rolly ball model, is that it's fairly easy to tune, right? Like you've got a few parameters. You can simplify these even further to allow your designers to really kind of tune these things for gameplay, to make all these cars feel different. And so what's nice is that because all of the actual mechanics of this thing come from this rolling ball, it's really easy to just kind of swap out your visuals. Right, so if I swap this buggy out for an arcade cabinet, let's say, because it's an arcade racer, I'm going to swap out this camera target. But really all this is just now I can drive an arcade cabinet around. It's got the same mechanics. It's got exactly the same handling as that buggy just now, but it's an arcade cabinet. I can swap that out for other stuff, a bike, a truck. So it's a lot of fun to kind of be able to do that. Something that I'm sure some of you will be asking about is the wheels. Let's look at the way the suspension kind of works. And I'm sure some of you will be asking about the suspension. I'll leave that to you to sort of investigate. in this sample project. We will go over animation rigging. It uses animation rigging mainly. We'll go over that, over animation rigging in a future webinar, but the the setup is here for you to take a look at. We're going to break for a short Q&A session before we continue onwards. So we've had a couple of pretty interesting questions in the Q&A so far. I think one that I do actually sort of touch on later, lightly, but one was basically about how do you stop cars flipping over if you're braking too hard when you're turning. This really relates more to if you're using spring suspension, typically like with wheel gliders, and what the usual sort of approach is to lower your center of mass. I've seen this done to a fairly extreme degree where the center of mass basically gets lowered below the ground. And this will stabilize your vehicle so it doesn't flip. But what it also does is it makes it changes your moment of inertia. So when you actually do leave the ground and start flipping or rolling, the rolling motion looks really weird. So what I've done and you can look at this in the sample project, what I've done in the custom physics, and you can do this with wheel gliders, is apply basically an anti-roll, or basically do a custom anti-roll bar, which I guess in a nutshell, it applies a reverse torque. So if your vehicle is rolling to one side, it applies a torque in order to kind of flatten out your vehicle so it doesn't kind of flip over. There's another about whether using this sort of add force for this rolly ball is better than using wheel gliders. And there are pros and cons to both. There are, I think, 3 or 4 different sort of approaches in the sample project. Using a rolly ball controller is really useful in something like an arcade racer or kart racer, just because you're looking at a very highly tunable or very easily tunable system compared to, say, wheel gliders, where because everything's sort of very physics-based, it's very realism-based, tuning things like how fast you turn, how fast you accelerate, what your top speed is, gets to be quite tricky because you're not dealing with hey, this is my top speed. You're dealing with torque on wheels. You're dealing with side friction on the wheels, which determines how you turn, rather than I just want to turn at 90 degrees per second, for example. Any more open questions? Rolling ball doesn't seem as though it could flip a vehicle. So that's correct. In this particular implementation, this rolling ball will always kind of try to align the vehicle to the ground. So if you're grounded, it will try to align this vehicle to the ground. So when you launch off in the air, you're not going to get any sort of forces that will flip the car. What you can do is, as you launch, you could say apply it. You'd have to do some calculations to figure out your curves and all that, but you could apply like a force to kind of start doing somersaults with the car. Okay, there's one more question. I'm not 100% sure what's going on with that. Yeah, I'm actually not 100% sure what's going on with that. There's a question about the Rollerball simple script in the sample project. Jandel's getting an error about not inheriting a native class. So I'm not 100% sure. There may be maybe there are other errors in the project. But yeah. That's all there is as far as the oh, actually, there's one good one I did answer earlier, which is, can we use sphere colliders directly on the wheels? I've seen it done before. I've experimented with it in the past, whereby instead of using, you know, sort of a raycast wheel or a wheel collider, you use a sphere collider, and you apply torque to that, and you use sphere colliders on each wheel, so you're able to apply torque on those sphere colliders. That way, you can kind of use the underlying physics engine to determine, sort of how much your wheels are spinning, how much force is being applied to the rigid body based on the friction of the wheels and the friction of the ground surface. So that's actually a pretty fun approach, using sphere colliders for your wheels. I think we do get um, you can get into a situation where if you have visually thin wheels, you will get contacts that don't actually match up with the wheels, because the sphere collider is naturally going to be a lot fatter than most wheels. That might be the issue. Janelle says using 2020. The project was built on 2021.2. I think it was .16 F1. So ideally, you'd be using that. I'm not sure if I have anything in there that is using, something that's not compatible with 2020. So I think that's it for the questions so far.
Let's continue.
So now we're going to look at wheel colliders. I'm going to jump back in the editor, and we're going to take a look at what these things are kind of made of. So I'm actually just going to jump into a new scene, and similarly, I'm just going to create just like a blank scene. Now I'm going to create an empty game object again, and I'm going to add a rigid body to it. Now the first thing to note about wheel colliders is that they're all basically tuned. The physics and the suspension and all the calculations are heavily tuned towards relatively realistic, sort of real world kind of values. So your masses are not going to be 1. You'll tend to glitch out pretty badly if you leave the masses at like 1. So I'm just going to go with 1500, about 1.5 tons. And I'm just going to leave that at that. I'm going to add a box just to have a visual and some collision. And I'm going to give it vaguely vaguely real world proportions. About 4 meters long, 2 meters wide. And so the first thing is that usually what we do is you'll create an empty game object. This is just for organization's sake. And then you'll create a couple of empty game objects for the wheels. For naming, I usually like to kind of do the 2-letter right, rear right, rear left, front right, front left, so RR, RL. So we'll add a wheel collider to this thing. And we'll generally place it someplace kind of vaguely sensible. All right, so let's say 1.25. All right, I'll duplicate this a couple times. Okay, we got our RL. This should actually be on the other side. This would be my FR. These should be at the back. My FR should be 1 and 1.25, and this should be -1, 1.25. This would be FL. So we've got 4 wheels. We've got a cube, and we've got a rigid body that's set to about 1500 mass. Now the fairly cool thing about wheel colliders is at this point I can just hit play, and we've got wheels. We've got wheels. We've got suspension. I can drop this thing from a height, and the suspension will kind of do its work. I'm going to flatten this out a bit. And so right off the bat, we've got we've got wheels that work. We've got suspension that works. We can play around with the suspension for all these wheel colliders, and this will affect things like handling, things like how high this thing sits. So this is the actual suspension distance in meters. So you can have like really high suspension. You can have like you can have like those low riders you see in like hip hop videos. You can have like really tall suspension, really short suspension. So this is in meters. Your typical real world suspension for a typical sort of family car would probably be about 0.2 to 0.3, basically 20 to 30 centimeters travel. The radius of the wheels makes a big difference, both for sort of how the car sits, as well as the amount of torque that it actually takes to move, to rotate the wheels. And then you've got mass, which affects the actual mass of the wheels. So it's in some ways, a fairly accurate simulation of a wheel. And so there's a bunch of parameters to be set. There's the spring coefficient. There's the damper coefficient. The spring. This essentially is like the spring force, how much the spring is pushing back against obstacles in the ground or undulations, maybe speed humps, let's say. The damper sort of affects how quickly or slowly the spring actually sort of compresses and sort of extends to and from its target position. And the target position essentially takes your suspension distance and says, I want to reach, let's say 0.8, which is sort of like at the top of the suspension. So it's basically trying to compress all the way, or or 0, which is basically like the suspension is completely extended. You're typically going to keep this within like the 0.3 to 0.7 range. Typically speaking, if you're looking at a regular sort of car, the default spring settings are actually pretty decent. These are fairly common spring and damper values. And really it becomes kind of about tuning how much, what the spring force is like and how much the damper is like based on what kind of car you're building, what kind of gameplay you're doing, how responsive it needs to be, how sort of rough the terrain it is that's going to be driving over. If you have very rough terrain and you have very stiff springs, you're going to kind of be jumping all over the place. If you have really sort of soft springs, then you'll get less responsiveness, handling wise, but the ride will be a lot smoother over rough terrain. So in addition to all these parameters, you've got these friction curves. The friction curves are essentially a sort of simplification of how tires, rubber, deforms and grips. It's the friction is sort of a little different from rigid objects, and so the friction curve kind of does a simplification to represent that kind of grip. Essentially, tires will grip as they deform, as you apply sort of like torque to them. They will grip. Their grip essentially increases up to a point, and then they start to slip. And so these values basically describe a curve that kind of goes from 0 to maximum grip and then a slip. So we'll look at the graph a little bit later. Now, one thing that doesn't show up here that is important is the motor force, the motor torque, and the brake torque. Now, we looked a bit at motor force, brake force earlier. This is using torque, which rotates the wheels. So essentially, you're basically applying a torque to rotate the wheels. The wheel collider kind of takes care of slowing the wheels down. It takes care of translating that torque to grip, whether or not the tire is slipping, and the resultant force on the car from that slip, from that friction. So we're going to take a little bit of a look at wheel colliders in practice. So you see over here, this is in scene or WC test in the sample project, and basically I've just got a simple truck with some collision on it, some wheel colliders, and with some visuals to go with them. The one thing about wheel colliders is that they don't make any sort of like provisions for visual wheels. The wheel colliders themselves don't ever change their transforms, so you can't kind of parent a wheel to like a visual wheel to the wheel colliders. So you do have to kind of actually update the visual wheels in script, and I'll show that in a little bit. We've got some wheels. And a script that controls everything. What you'll see is this is a super slidey car. It likes to kind of slide. It likes to drift a little too much. And one thing you will sort of find about wheel colliders is that while they are really useful for having kind of like really nice suspension, the suspension model is great actually. The way it handles bumps and terrain and how you tune the suspension is really quite good. But kind of tuning things like handling, especially if you're looking for fast vehicles that kind of drift a lot or have very predictable kind of turning radius, it can be a bit tricky. And really a lot of that involves tuning really things like a little bit of like the springs, the dampers, but also a lot of like the forward friction. You'll see here I'm dynamically changing the stiffness values of my wheels based on my speed, based on how much they're slipping, and this sort of drives like how it's sliding along. So if it's spinning a lot, I actually reduce the sideways friction even more, so that I get that sort of like drift and donut kind of behavior. So we'll take a look at this script and we'll see what's going on there. So here again, we've got some parameters that we expose: motor torque, brake torque, and steer angle. So these three are actually sort of the main ones that you will typically sort of modify as a starting point. Your motor torque is what drives your car, brake torque is what stops it, and your steer angle is in degrees, like how many degrees on either side that your wheel will turn. And so all that basically, again, physics, it all goes in fixed update. And so basically you're going into each of your wheels and you're applying your brake torque, and you're applying your brake torque based on, again, your input values times the brake torque that you assigned. In this case, I've got a brake ratio so that I can assign more braking to, let's say, the front wheels versus the back wheels. We've got the drive where, again, you're applying the motor torque based on your acceleration input times your motor torque. And again, similar to the rolly ball, I've got a torque curve that I apply, and I evaluate that based on my forward velocity. Similar to the brakes, I've got a drive ratio so that I can say more, if I can do like a four-wheel drive, but have, say, 80% of the drive go to the rear wheels instead of the front wheels, 20% to the front wheels. Now, I mentioned earlier that the wheel colliders don't actually kind of handle the visuals, visual like rotation as well as the sort of steer angle. And so what I usually like to do, I don't always do it, but usually what ends up happening is I'll create like a sort of a helper, like a helper class that takes a wheel collider and kind of does a lot of the updating for me. So I don't really need to do that manually in my vehicle classes. So this is sort of the key thing. All right, your get world pose. The wheel collider comes with a get world pose method, and it passes out a position and a rotation. So this is a vector 3, this is a quaternion. And essentially from there, all you need to do is set your position and rotation. And that's basically it as far as that goes. And that will take care of both the steer angle as well as the rotation of the tires based on whether they're rolling, whether they're being driven by the motor torque. So that makes it pretty easy. So you can put this in your vehicle class. I tend to break it out into its own sort of helper class. So you see wheel collider object, so I can kind of basically determine whether or not it's a drive wheel, whether it's a steering wheel, and I can do all sorts of other sort of helper things over there. So that is basically what's taking care of turning the wheels when I steer and spinning the wheels when I'm kind of driving them and rolling along. Let's take a quick break for Q&A before we move on to the last little section. Right, we've had quite a number of good questions. There's no more open. Yeah, my teammates are being pretty good about kind of blowing through these questions. Let me see. There were a couple that kind of caught my eye earlier. Sorry. Let me see. So there are a couple of things, a couple of questions asking about the friction of the surfaces. So somebody had asked, let's say if my object enters or goes over, say, an icy surface or like a dirt surface, a grassy surface, how would you sort of handle that? And that kind of comes down to your colliders, whether it's a whether it's a box collider, a sphere collider, a mesh collider. All the colliders have a material a field, and those allow you to assign physics materials, and those are created in your asset as assets in your project, and those will determine the static friction, dynamic friction, and the bounciness of a particular collider. So depending on how you're kind of using your physics, whether you're doing custom physics or wheel colliders or like that rolly ball, you can then kind of use those parameters. Now, one thing I didn't actually sort of mention is that wheel colliders themselves don't actually interact with physics materials. So the wheel collider's friction, the grip, won't actually be affected by your physics materials. What typically will happen in those situations is that when you're doing your wheel collider itself has sort of a rake. It will return a wheel collider hit, I think it was, which is like a raycast hit, and that includes the collider information. From there, you can get the physics material of that collider. So whatever the wheel collider is sort of resting on, and from there you would basically use the friction value. So let's say your dynamic friction is, I don't know, 0.1 for say an icy surface, and you would actually multiply the stiffness of the tire the forward and side slip curves, and so that would basically make your wheels slip more. Similarly, if it was say asphalt, which might have a dynamic friction of say zero 0.8, you would kind of do that multiplication so that you would be more or less slippery on different surfaces. There is let me see. Oh, okay, so there was a question about gravity. You can change the gravity either at the project level, which is in your project settings. So you can change project settings physics. You can kind of change your gravity from the default, which is basically Earth gravity, or you can do it dynamically in scripts. So let's say if you're loading up a different scene, different level, in basically like the startup scripts for that level, you might modify the gravity. So you might set gravity into vector 3. So instead of the default of like 0 minus 9.810, you might change it to something a little bit less, 0 minus 3, 0, which might be something like, I don't know, Venus, maybe? I don't know. But you can sort of modify that dynamically or at a project level. And the project is available for download, yes. We'll send the link to you in the follow-up emails for the webinar. It's also available in the chat. It's I think it's the second message in the chat window. Colliders for irregular objects like surface model with lesser thickness. Irregular objects, you might just use like a mesh collider, or you might actually use compound colliders, which are basically you just inside or as a child of a rigid body, you can add multiple objects with colliders on them. So you can basically create like a car collision shape by taking a rigid body and sticking a bunch of boxes, and rotating and scaling those boxes to make your shape of the car. I think we're good for now. I think we can go on, and we'll open up for more questions at the end. So now we're going to take a look at, well, it's more of an advanced teaser than a primer, because there's honestly way too much to kind of cover in a short portion of a webinar session. So we're going to jump into the editor, and we're going to take a look at one of these setups. So this is it's basically a completely custom vehicle controller, custom physics. It takes some cues from like the wheel colliders, but does a lot of things sort of differently. So I do have similar sort of like concepts. I've got my force curve, torque curve, in terms of how I'm applying my torque based on my speed, so that I get that that sort of fake gearing and that gearing system. But I've added a couple of things like axles, so that I can make sure that wheels are kind of paired up. And I've got my suspension damping, which is not here. It's actually on the wheels. Like I said, there's a lot to clean up here. I've got some differential, which allows me to, well, essentially it allows me to modify both the torque that gets applied as well as kind of how the friction gets applied based on how compressed, essentially how hard that wheel is pressing into the ground. And then just things I can tune, like how much my speed affects my turn radius, so I don't turn too hard when I'm traveling fast. Especially, this is especially useful, important when using a keyboard, because with a keyboard you're either going straight or you're fully turned. So what's typically useful is to kind of provide a way to reduce the turn angle when you're going at high speeds. And so this basically goes from turn radius of 3 to a turn radius of 7 as I go from 0 to top speed. There's a bunch of other stuff that like brake lights and stuff, but that's not that important. You can take a look at it in the sample project. We'll take a look at the wheels now, the axles actually first. So the axles will essentially bind two wheels together. So we've got an axle, and each axle can be set to either drive or not drive, and whether it's a steering axle. And this affects whether the steering inputs will turn the wheels. It'll affect whether the drive inputs will spin the wheels. The torque weight is sort of similar to previously with the wheel colliders, where I can determine how much torque I'm actually putting. So if I'm doing a four-wheel drive, I can do 50%, 50%, or I can do like 80-20 or something, something different. Similarly over here. So I've got basically sort of a 2/3, 1/3 ratio here. At 1 in the back and half in the front. That's a 2/3 ratio. The wheels you can see are somewhat similar to the wheel collider with gizmos, so I can set the suspension target. Wheel front left. So I can set the suspension target, and I can set the suspension strength, the amount of damping. The stiffness relates actually to the amount of grip that happens. And I'm not using like a friction curve, I'm just using a straight linear grip. The suspension length, so I can make longer or shorter suspensions, and the wheel radius. So some of this is quite similar to the wheel colliders. Now if I were to start this up, so I can go in and change up the wheel radius, and this will affect kind of the handling, how it sits, as well as kind of how much torque actually, or how much the torque actually sort of can drive the wheel. Larger wheels take more torque to drive, basically. If you sort of crank up the suspension strength, the suspension length. You can sort of get something like this. I've cranked up the suspension length, but the strength isn't really that high, so it's not lifting it. So I can just kind of lift it up. So now I've got a very, very high ride, very stiff. It's probably going to be quite unstable, and also because I'm actually losing a lot of grip on the front. So I mentioned earlier it's really useful to have debug sort of info printed out as you're developing these things, because it allows you to kind of figure out things like, are my wheels slipping? Do I have any actual traction on my front wheels? So this kind of gives you good information on what's going on and why your vehicles are maybe not handling like they should, or that you think they should. And having this sort of info is really useful. So one thing that you will actually want to do, whether or not you're using wheel colliders or using like a custom sort of wheel system setup suspension, is an anti-roll bar. Now, an anti-roll bar is in an actual car, basically, in a physical car, basically, we'll say will stop the vehicle from rolling. So as one spring is getting compressed because you're, say, taking a turn really hard, one side of the vehicle will start to kind of compress. That'll be the outside of the turn. If you don't have an anti-roll bar, what will happen is your car will possibly have a tendency to flip over if it compresses hard enough and if you're kind of going fast enough. And so an anti-roll bar will essentially try to stiffen out and flatten out the car. So if you don't have an anti-roll bar, or if you don't have an anti-roll bar, what can happen is, I'm going to turn off the anti-roll here. What can potentially happen is as you're taking a very hard turn, that was just from me falling off. But if you take a very hard turn, you can potentially flip over because your suspension is kind of, okay, there we go. So you can kind of potentially flip over because your suspension is not trying to level itself out. Alternately, you can kind of do that. So what the anti-roll bar in my implementation does is it basically just applies a reverse torque based on how much the difference in suspension is. It will apply a reverse torque to that, and that will try to help to right the car. It doesn't mean you can't flip. It just means that you're less likely to flip due to your suspension kind of like compressing on one side of the car. So that's actually really important to use even if you're using wheel colliders. What I've seen, a common thing that I've seen done is instead of implementing a proper sort of anti-roll bar is to actually lower your center of mass. And it's lower your center of mass so that you're in a way you're more stable because you're less likely to roll over because your center of mass is so low. But what happens with the center of mass being that low is you get all sorts of really weird other side effects. Like if you do sort of leave the ground, you get this weird sort of righting effect where your car will kind of try to right itself, even if it leaves the ground and it's sort of going sideways, it will have a tendency to right itself, which is kind of weird. The other thing is that if you lower the center of mass low enough, like right now it's below the car, as I'm turning, you'll see I'm tilting the wrong way, basically. And all sorts of things happen with the weight shift. How the weight shift happens is all wrong. When I'm accelerating, you see I'm tipping forward instead of tipping backward. If I put my center of mass back to where it should be, there. That's too. So if I put the center of mass back where it should be, you'll see that as I accelerate, my car kind of tilts back because of how the forces are and how the forces are being applied at the bottom. So that's the other thing. If you're doing any custom solutions that involve wheels, you're typically going to apply the forces at the contact point. And that sort of has this natural effect of, making the car kind of rock back and forth as you brake, as you accelerate, and as you turn. You'll see it kind of shift left and right due to those springs, basically. So if we take a look at the code here, there's quite a lot going on. It's not something I'm going to go through in a few minutes, but it's something that you can look through. It'll be in the sample project, so you can kind of dig through. It's still a work in progress. It will still evolve, but essentially it handles a lot of things like engine braking. When you release the accelerator, it does sort of like an engine brake. It does some calculations per wheel, per suspension, to figure out how much force, essentially how compressed the spring is, in order to figure out how how much power to transfer to the wheel, as well as how much how much friction actually affects. So if the wheel is kind of like not really compressed, it means like there's not much weight on the wheel, in which case it's going to get less friction, and so you get all sorts of really interesting um, sort of things that happen naturally, like if you brake hard and your rear wheels get less traction, you will tend to slide out. Your rear wheels will tend to slide out nicely. Um, so it's kind of fun to kind of play with that. And it's something you can kind of dive into. There's two setups here with the same controller, but this one, the Lancia scene, has a four-wheel drive setup. Like I said earlier, it's like a 60. It's like a 2/3 drive in the back, 1/3 drive in the front, and there's a two-wheel drive here, which is pure two-wheel drive. This one tends to spin out a lot more. You know, the back tends to throw out. You tend to throw out the back a lot more when you're driving, compared to the four-wheel drive, and that sort of works out, right? Like your four-wheel drive will tend to try to right you because your front wheels, as they're turning, will try to pull you forward rather than if you're just driving with the back wheels, they'll tend to try to oversteer. So there's a lot to go through, and so there's a lot to go through, and I know this was kind of a bit of a teaser, but this is sort of a teaser for like something that will run, you know, I guess in the near future. We're gonna have something on Discord. It'll probably be something like a live stream where I'll do a more of a deep dive into everything that goes in, all the research that I've done, a lot of the math, a lot of the physics. We're really gonna go just deep dive into physics, how the friction is calculated, how the how your suspension affects friction, how it affects your handling. So we don't have a concrete schedule for this yet, but indicate your interest in the survey form so we can kind of let you know when this is happening. We can kind of gauge how much how much interest there is. Yeah, this will be like my tech talk, where I'll just deep dive into physics, car physics especially. And that pretty much brings me to the end. We'll go to live questions.
Awesome job, Tech. Thank you. Sarah, if you can, when you have a moment, if you can bring up the swag pack slide, that would be great. And the team are going to look through any final questions at the moment. Just a reminder, the survey link form will soon be coming into the chat box. I believe it is there. We really value your input and feedback on these sessions so that we can better construct the content that is relevant for you. This is part 2 of a part 5 series, so we'd love to know how you're tracking. Give us your feedback in that form. Today, there will be one lucky swag pack winner from one of our registered attendees that'll be drawn about 30 minutes after the webinar. But in just a moment, Tech is going to announce the winner of today's best question, who will also be receiving a swag pack. This is just for the Zoom audience. And please stay online. If yours is the best question, you'll be getting a message from me any moment. So Tech, do we have a winner for today's question?
We do. So we had a bit of a discussion, and we're going to go with, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right, but it's Mayank Sharma. And his question, I'm sorry, I actually don't know. The question here was, if we want to make our object drift only in some circumstance, then how can we do this? We thought it was it's not the usual sort of question. It's not super technical, but it's like it was a really interesting and very on topic question.
Excellent. I'm just reaching out. Sorry, Tech, can you spell the first couple of letters for me, please?
Sure, it's Mayyank.
Okay, got it. Yep.
So I'm gonna go ahead and post the let me see. I'm gonna go ahead and post my little spiel about the sample project in the chat again. Where is it? There we go. Yeah. So if you want to take a look at the sample project, it's the link is in the chat. Again, as I mentioned in the little chat message, it's not the cleanest sort of project right now. It's still sort of well, it's still very much in R&D experimentation phase. But there's a lot of stuff to kind of dig into. There's stuff that I didn't actually cover in this because there's a lot of different sort of experiments that I went through. But feel free to dive in, and at some point when we have like our sort of Discord stream, we'll cover that in more detail.
Mayank, if you're still with us, can you please respond to the message in the chat window that I've sent to you privately for your email address so that we can arrange your swag pack for the best questions and best question, and Tex, I'll let you continue on. Was there any more you wanted to cover?
I think there was one that was, wait, let me see. Oh yeah, there was one that actually just got asked about whether you can add this to an open world game. Yeah, that's absolutely a thing. Actually, when we were discussing this as a team, and I started showing the first like the rolly ball thing with the buggy driving around, and we started sort of spitballing ideas about bigger games instead of a track game, a bigger game, or like a car combat game, or things like that. It's all of these are going to be flexible enough to use in different scenarios, so you can tune them based on your needs. In terms of how fast they accelerate, how fast they can go, things like that. So yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Mayank. I've got your email address. And we have a very new series coming very shortly in the coming weeks. Tech, you've probably not seen him very much on in some of our webinars over the last 12 months. That's because he's been on assignment in the game studio. So he's definitely the man you want to be having a chat to. And Tech is going to be delivering some series of webinars on topics that are not related to the engine and particular features, but more about general areas of technology and advancements such as the metaverse and what opportunities exist there, etc. So stay tuned for that on our social media and email. It will be our play on TED Talks, but it'll be our own tech. And if there's no more further questions there
come to my tech talk.
Forward to that, buddy. Looking forward to that. If there's no more questions for today, please remember the survey form. We're looking forward to seeing you next week for part 3, and we're really hoping we'd love to see some of your projects at the end of this after you've learnt each of the various topics to be able to create your own arcade racer. Have a great weekend, everybody. Take care. Let's see you next week. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.